Good evening. I'm Rufus Brown, and tonight, we're back on the battlefield of global trade, examining an economic conflict that, despite a high-stakes handshake, has entered its most treacherous phase yet. In late October 2025, the world watched as President Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping met in South Korea, emerging with an announced trade truce, a deal that included a lifeline for American agriculture. China reportedly committed to buying a massive 12 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans by the end of the year, with a staggering 25 million tons annually over the next 3 years. This was heralded as a diplomatic victory, a moment of reprieve for the farmers caught in the crossfire. But just 2 weeks later, the hope has withered. The commercial reality on the ground here, in mid-November 2025, is one of soybean silence. Chinese commercial buyers have effectively stopped placing new orders. The deal, announced with fanfare, has exposed not a restored partnership, but a devastating trap that leaves the American farmer out in the cold, facing a full-blown crisis as they prepare for the 2026 planting season. The history: how reliance became vulnerability. To understand the scale of this betrayal, we have to look back at the foundation of this reliance. For decades, the flow of U.S. soybeans to China was one of the most reliable and valuable trade routes on the planet. China's rising middle class drove a booming demand for meat, requiring colossal amounts of soy meal for animal feed. The partnership started seriously in the early 2000s, with China becoming our single largest customer. It peaked in the years before the 2018 trade war, with the U.S. shipping roughly 60% of its total export volume, billions of dollars in value, to China annually. When President Trump initiated the trade war in 2018, China's retaliation was not arbitrary. It was a surgical strike. They targeted U.S. soybeans with a hefty retaliatory tariff, effectively shutting down the route and inflicting maximum political pain on a key American voting base. Our exports collapsed. The 2020 Phase 1 deal offered a brief, mandated recovery, but the damage was done. When tariffs escalated again in 2025, culminating in a duty rate that made our product economically impossible to buy, the supply line was completely severed. The United States had become strategically vulnerable. And while we relied on them, China found a way to rely on someone else. The Brazilian weapon, a permanent pivot. China did not stop needing soybeans. They simply rerouted the flow, executing a brilliant, long-term geopolitical strategy that weaponized the commodity. They shifted their purchasing power almost entirely to Brazil. This pivot was not just a knee-jerk reaction to tariffs. It was a massive, calculated investment in China's own food security and supply chain control. China poured capital into upgrading the infrastructure of Brazil and Latin America, funding new railways that cut through the jungle, modernizing port facilities, and building deep-water terminals. This investment gave them two critical strategic advantages. First, control. They are now financing and controlling the logistics that feed their nation, bypassing the American political system entirely. Second, competition. Brazil's soybean production soared to meet the guaranteed Chinese demand. Brazil is now the undisputed global leader in production and exports, offering a cheaper, tariff-free alternative. In 2025, while U.S. exports to China went to near zero, Brazil's shipments set new records. They have fully stepped into the vacuum we left. The trap: why the truce failed commercially. Now, let's fast forward to the present. The South Korea truce was meant to reverse this. It was a political order from the top: buy American soy. But here is the core commercial failure. Politics can announce a deal, but economics still dictates its execution. The promised surge in buying has not materialized because the commercial incentives are simply not there. The main hurdles are threefold. 1. The lingering tariff. Despite the suspension of many tariffs, a significant duty around 13% remains in place on U.S. soybeans. That single percentage point differential is enough to render American soybeans commercially uncompetitive compared to their Brazilian counterparts. Analysts calculate that, even at current prices, a shipment of U.S. soy delivered to a Chinese port is roughly $1.50 per bushel more expensive than a Brazilian one. 2. China's record glut. China rushed to buy massive volumes from South America earlier this year, fearing the trade war would continue indefinitely. The result? As of mid-November, Chinese ports are sitting on a record-high inventory of soybeans and processed soy meal. The demand is saturated. Chinese crushing firms, which convert the beans into feed and oil, are facing negative profit margins. They have zero commercial incentive to buy high-priced, tariff-hit American beans for the state, especially when they are already oversupplied. 3. State versus commerce. The few orders that were placed after the truce were almost exclusively made by Chinese state-owned companies. These purchases are a direct response to the political order, symbolic gestures intended to fulfill the quota announced by Washington. They are not genuine commercial transactions driven by market need. Once the symbolic gesture is done, the buying stops. And it has. The truce, therefore, is not a restoration of the market. It is a political mandate that the market is refusing to obey. The American market has rallied on the hope of the deal, but the actual beans are not moving. The crisis. The 2026 planting season, this commercial silence is creating a full-blown crisis for the American Farm Belt, with farmers now facing their most critical decision. What do I plant in the spring of 2026? This is the narrow, crucial window when U.S. farmers finalize their planting intentions. The hope generated by the South Korea deal, which caused U.S. soybean futures prices to briefly rally, suggested that soybean would be more profitable than corn. Many farmers, encouraged by the headlines, were leaning toward planting more soybean acres in the spring. But without real, sustained Chinese commercial buying, that rally will be short-lived. The U.S. has only a few weeks left to sell significant volumes of the current harvest before the massive new Brazilian crop begins flooding the global market in January and February 2026. Brazil is forecasting another record harvest, potentially over 177 million tons, cementing their dominance. If U.S. farmers plant a large soybean crop based on a political deal that failed commercially, they risk creating a huge, unsellable domestic surplus, driving prices down well below the break-even point. They could be forced to harvest a crop they can't afford to store and can't afford to sell. Conclusion: the new economic war, or the soybean trap, is a stark lesson in 21st century economic warfare. China successfully leveraged its status as a buyer to strategically diversify its supply base and create a permanent, cheaper alternative in Brazil. The political truce in South Korea provided diplomatic cover, but it failed to dismantle the commercial structure that China so carefully built. The economic war over soybeans is not over. It has simply moved from the tariff stage to the structural displacement stage. The American farmer now stands alone, forced to bet their livelihood on whether Washington can force Beijing to buy product that runs at a loss, or whether they must finally accept the new brutal reality that the market share lost to Brazil may never be regained. The map of global agriculture has been permanently redrawn. That's the last thing before sleeping. I'll see you next time.